more than any of the other churches. At most, you have like 1st and 2nd Corinthians, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. And so the church at Ephesus receiving a lot of attention in the 1st century. In writing to the church at Ephesus, Jesus identifies himself as the one who holds the 7 stars and who walks among the 7 golden lampstands. Now, what do you think might be communicated in using this image? The way that Jesus wants to identify himself to the church at Ephesus is the one who holds the 7 stars, who walks among the 7 golden lampstands. What might he be communicating by saying, this is who I am? Okay, it might suggest that he knows all. I mean, that's certainly suggested by when he starts talking about, I know.
That he's with them and that he's all the church.
All right, so he's with them, he's participating them, he's got them under control, or he's got them in his power, right? And so that's the image that's suggested here and reinforced by then saying, I know. Well, what does Jesus know? He knows what the Ephesians Christians have been doing. Specifically, the idea here that's presented is that the Ephesians have been doing some good works. We can think of service, we can think of how they're treating each other. Right? I know your works, I know what you've been doing, I'm in your midst. Secondly, that you cannot bear those who are evil, that you have tested those who call themselves apostles, and that you found them to be false. Right? So they have examined teachers that have come to Ephesus. And so the Ephesians appear to have been committed to rooting out false teachers. Finding those people that taught false doctrine and making sure that their message didn't spread. Now, one of the things that's interesting about this is a connection here to the book of Acts. Somebody turn to Acts chapter 20 and read verses 28 through 31. Acts 20, 28 through 31.
Pay careful attention to yourselves and to all the flock, in which the Holy Spirit has made you overseers, to care for the church of God, which he obtained with his own blood. I know that after my departure, fierce wolves will come in among you, not sparing the flock. And from among your own selves you will arise men speaking twisted things, to draw away the disciples after them. Therefore be alert, remembering that for 3 years I did not cease night or day to admonish everyone with tears.
Right. Why were the Ephesians so committed to rooting out false teachers? Well, it may be. I mean, Luke suggests that one of the last things Paul warns the Ephesians about is false teachers are going to arise, even from among the elders. And so I think what this represents is that they took that to heart. And so they were really committed to making sure false teaching didn't arise. And in all of that, like we've seen in chapter 1, there's this emphasis on enduring patiently, right? And so they're committed to the teachings of Jesus, right? And they're facing some opposition, but they're committed to that teaching. But not everything is going well in Ephesus. Jesus has something. There's something wrong in Ephesus. And a lot of it depends on how we translate that phrase. This is in verse 4 of chapter 2. Sorry, I got distracted and went right in and we didn't even read the letter. I have this against you, that you have abandoned the love you had at first. Now some of your translations might say you've abandoned your first love. So what's he talking about? I mean, if we take it as you have abandoned the love you had at first, what might Jesus be saying has happened at Ephesus? You've abandoned the love you had at first. Change of heart. They've lost some of the passion, the spiritual fervor, right? That emotional, fire that they had after their conversion. Now, if it's you've abandoned your first love, what might that mean?
They've turned away completely.
Yeah, specifically from God and Jesus, right? And so, in one sense, we could say, well, maybe some of the passion, the spiritual fervor has died. Right? They've had this kind of change of heart, or they've kind of abandoned Jesus emotionally, right? Because they're still holding on to the teaching, right? So they haven't abandoned the doctrine, but by using this phrase "love," it's almost as if there's emotional connection that's been lost. So they've got the doctrine right, but the emotion's gone. In whatever way, whether that's the emotional fervor that they had or their emotional connection to Jesus. Right? So it's a church that has, is very on fire to keep the doctrine true, the teaching true, but not as on fire with love. Implicit suggestion meaning that Jesus wants both, right? Because I know that you've been rooting out those false teachers, but you've lost that love. You've lost that loving feeling. That song was recorded before I was born, just so everybody knows that. Remember then from when you've fallen. And so whatever's happened, whether they've abandoned the love they had for Jesus or the spiritual fervor that they've had, they've fallen from that. Remember where you've fallen from, and then repent. Right? Make a change. Get that back. Certainly suggesting that, if it's that kind of emotional fervor, that can be recaptured. Right? It's not a slide. We can think of, and often people kind of accept this idea of when somebody's converted, they're really on fire for God emotionally. And they're really wanting to be involved, they're wanting to tell everybody, and then gradually they kind of slide off. And in churches, we kind of almost accepted that that's got to be the case. That Jesus kind of suggests here of, you can recapture that. He wants the Ephesians to recapture that, and bring that fire back to life. If they don't, however, Jesus has a warning for them. The warning is that He will come and remove their lampstand. What does that mean? In warning them that He will come and remove their lampstand, what does that mean?
Well, Christ is called a light to the world, and so by saying, I will remove your lampstand, I will remove myself from you, and I will no longer be your guiding light if you continue to fail and do the things of which I have asked you not to do.
So, that idea of the removal of Christ's presence. What else does that mean? Well, the lampstand represents what? It represents the church. So He's going to remove their lampstands. They're not going to be a church anymore, at least in the eyes of God. Right? And so they probably could continue meeting, but Jesus doesn't recognize them as a church, which is kind of a little bit of a scary thing. Right? If that's the possibility where a church could no longer be recognized as a church in the eyes of God, this is some serious business that John is communicating here from Jesus. But again, that not everything is going wrong in Ephesus. Specifically, Jesus says, you hate the work of the Nicolaitans. Now, let's see, what time is it? All right, we have about 20 minutes. Okay. I want to make sure we have enough time because I want to share with you everything we know for certain about the Nicolaitans. All right? And so I want to make sure I have enough time. So, what is certain about the Nicolaitans? Okay, we're done. There's absolutely nothing we can say for certain about the Nicolaitans. A lot of people have said, well, it could be this, it could be that, it could be that, and so I'll mention that. But there's not really anything for certain because the name doesn't appear anywhere else in Christian documents except people talking about Revelation, and so there's no indication exactly what is going on here. Some claim that they got their name from Nicholas, one of the 7 in Acts 6. Right? Acts 6, there is a problem where widows of Hellenistic Jews aren't being supplied food, daily rations. And so the apostles say, pick 7 men that we can appoint in charge of this work. One of them is a man named Nicholas. And so the suggestion is that this group had gotten their name from him. Others claim that they were a Gnostic sect. Gnostic is Gnostic. The Gnostics were an early Christian heretical group that emphasized the spirit as opposed to the flesh. Anything fleshly was evil, anything spiritual was good. And so they claimed that Jesus didn't come in the flesh. They had a lot of weird beliefs that we don't have time to get into. And so some people say that's who these people were. Some say that if you look at what the different parts of their name means, like if you look at it in Greek or compare it to some Hebrew things, it may have something to do with eating foods sacrificed to idols. Right? And so it's not really a name of a person, it's kind of a name that gets thrown together. Other people suggested that the Nicolaitans were people that were encouraging the church to assimilate to their culture, to make accommodations. Whatever this group is, Jesus does not like it in Revelation, right? And the Ephesians don't like it. And because the Ephesians don't like it, that's one thing that the Ephesians have got right. Each of the letters, as we mentioned, has this phrase, the one who has ears to hear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. So first of all, Jesus is the one giving the message to John, but Jesus is telling the church, listen to what the Spirit is saying. And so the Spirit is still providing the power, the livingness of the Word, even though Jesus is the one dictating. And also it is the message to the churches, even though this is a letter to the Ephesians. Right? And so all churches should pay attention to each of these messages. And so even though it's specifically directed to Ephesus, there is a message here for all the churches of Asia, and really all the churches all the time. Right? Because, even today we can think of, and this might be a direction you go in your reflection paper. We can think of churches that are really good about doctrine, but that emotional connection, that emotional love might not be there, might not be as present. And so listen to what the Spirit says to the churches. To the one who conquers. The Greek word that's translated conquer there is the Greek word Nike, which, yes, is where the company got it from. Right? Nike, translated conquer or overcome, also has in mind the goddess of victory, the goddess Nike. So there's a lot of things here from Greek culture. Right? So if you wanted victory, you appealed to the goddess Nike. Well, who's really given victory here? Right? It's Jesus. Right? And so there's a lot of these kind of ways in which Jesus is opposing himself to the emperor as God, to the pagan deities as God as well. Right? And so to the one who overcomes, who truly overcomes. Well, what is the church at Ephesus? What's the promise to the church at Ephesus? To the church at Ephesus, the one who overcomes, the one who conquers, will have the opportunity to eat of the tree of life in the paradise of God. All right, what does that mean? What's being promised here? In this symbolic language, what's being promised? What does it mean to eat of the tree of life in the paradise of God? Everlasting life. Right? The tree of life, which had been, human beings had been separated from in Genesis chapter 3 because of Adam and Eve's sin. Jesus promises, you have that opportunity. That return to the paradise of God or to Eden. And I think also there's a way in which this connects back to the beginning of the church at Ephesus, the letter of the church at Ephesus when Jesus is walking among the lampstands, and how that kind of brings to mind now God walking in the cool of the evening with Adam and Eve. Smyrna, and this time we will read the letter. I forgot to have us read Ephesus, but we want to stick with the text here. And so if somebody would read verses 8 through 11 of chapter 2, 8 through 11 of chapter 2.
And to the angel of the church in Smyrna write, the words of the first and the last who died and came to life. I know your tribulation and your poverty, but you are rich, and the splendor of those who say that they are Jews and are not, but are a synagogue of Satan. Do not fear that you are about to suffer. Behold, the devil is about to throw some of you into prison, that you may be tested, and for 10 days you will have tribulation. Be faithful unto death, and I will give you the crown of life. He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. The one who conquers will not be hurt by the second death.
The modern-day city Izmir in Turkey is the location of ancient Smyrna, and so there's there's still a presence there. At the time that John is writing, Smyrna was an old city, prosperous and large. It was also a center of emperor worship, and we'll talk a little bit about that here in some of the things later on. But it was also supposedly one of the most beautiful cities in Asia at the time. So, it's an old city, very prosperous city, also a very beautiful city. It was also home to a famous early Christian martyr named Polycarp. Polycarp was the 2nd century. Polycarp was sentenced to death for being a Christian. Polycarp, at the time he is arrested and sentenced, is a rather old man. Had tried to hide out, escape for some time, but eventually is captured, gives himself up. And as he is on trial, getting ready to be burned at the stake, the official that's kind of conducting the proceedings, essentially says to Polycarp, "What's the big deal? Just say Caesar is Lord." Right? And he kind of has this compassion because of Polycarp's age, so he encourages him, just say Caesar is Lord, and then it'll be done. We'll let you go. And Polycarp says something to the effect of, that Jesus had never abandoned him in his 84 years of life. How could Polycarp abandon Jesus? And so, this city, is a small church here, but we have a very powerful witness in the life of Polycarp out of facing persecution. The first and the last. These are the words of the first and the last. We already talked about the connection to the Alpha and the Omega, that notion of beginning and ending, totality. And also the one who died and came back to life. So this is how Jesus is identifying himself to the church at Smyrna. We can kind of see how that would fit, because Jesus warns the church at Smyrna that persecution is coming. But he is the first and the last. He's the one who's died and come back to life. Right? And so he's promising them, right, it's all under my control, and I bring back to life. Right? I came back to life. You will be protected in all of this. What does Jesus know about the church at Smyrna? Well, he knows their tribulation, their affliction. He knows the suffering they have gone through. There's some sort of persecution that Smyrna was facing, the Christians in Smyrna were facing. He knows their poverty. Now, probably what's meant here is that the Christians as a whole in Smyrna were poor Christians, which may have been a part of the fact that here they are in the center of emperor worship, and they are refusing to worship the emperor, and so they would have probably had some sort of financial consequences out of that. And so they don't have strong poverty, they don't have strong financial resources, but Jesus tells them, but you really are rich. Right? I know your poverty, but you're really rich. And so they're rich spiritually, even though they're not rich physically. And he also knows the slander that they've experienced, right? The things people have been saying about these followers of Jesus. Specifically, that slander has come from what appears to be Jewish quarters. And so Jesus refers to those who say they are Jews and says that they're a synagogue of Satan. By the end of the first century, there is a lot of opposition for followers of Jesus from Jews. First of all, for those Jews that had accepted Jesus as the Messiah, people like John. But then also for those God-fearers, right? People that were Gentiles that had followed some Jewish traditions who had converted to the message of Jesus as well. The other thing that's going on here is so there's that opposition there, but also Jews are wanting to distance themselves from Christians because Rome is paying more and more attention to Christians, and so some Jews are trying to say, that's not us, right? Don't come down on the Jews, they're not Jews. But essentially what Jesus is saying, what John's saying, is that true Jews follow Jesus as Messiah. And so this idea of the spiritual Israel, the true Israel were people who trusted God through faith, is the way Paul puts it in Romans, particularly faith in Christ. And so there's this distinction that's being made here between those that are Jews, that are true Jews, following Jesus as Messiah, versus those Jews who are actually working for Satan. They're not Satan worshipers, but essentially they're working for Satan, even though they don't know it. There were Christians at the church at Smyrna who were getting ready to be thrown into prison. And this was to test them. And this being thrown into prison was going to last for 10 days. Now, but in saying 10 days, what might be symbolized here? You're going to be thrown into prison for 10 days. If it's not 10 literal days, what's it mean? Is 10 days a long time? So I wouldn't want to be in prison for 10 days, but 10 days isn't a long time, right? So the idea is that it's not going to be a long time. It's temporary. Right? There's a completeness to it. It's a beginning and end. But it's not something that's going to be substantial. Right? So it's a temporary trial that they'll face. There might also be here a reference to Daniel chapter 1. In Daniel chapter 1, Daniel and his 3 friends are taken captive by the Babylonians and are going to be serving at King Nebuchadnezzar's court. But they refuse to eat the foods given to them because of their consciences and possibly, they were foods that would break the law, the law of Moses, and so they couldn't eat them. And so Daniel and his friends say, test us for 10 days. Right? And see how we look. And of course, after 10 days, they look better, they're in better health than the people eating the king's rations. Right? And so maybe that is a symbol behind this, right? Because Daniel, the book of Daniel shows up quite frequently in Revelation, so maybe that's where the 10 days comes from. But it's a temporary time. Jesus encourages the church at Smyrna to be faithful until death. Now you might have, the translation might say unto death, and so sometimes this passage gets used of, from now to when you die, be faithful. Which is true, that's a good thing, right? Be faithful to Jesus from now until when you die. But what's also being suggested here is be faithful even to the point of death. Even if it requires you to die, be faithful. Right? Like Polycarp, right? I mean, Polycarp seems to have taken that to heart. He was going to be faithful even to the point of death. And if the church at Smyrna was faithful until death, they would receive the crown of life. There are 2 different words, 2 different Greek words translated crown in the English New Testament of Revelation. The first is diadema. That crown suggests the crown of royalty, right? The diadem. And so that's what the one crown said. This is not that crown. The crown of life is actually the other term, Stephanos. The Stephanos crown suggested the crown of victory, like would be given to a successful Olympian, right? The laurel crown, right? And so this idea of success or victory. That's the crown Jesus promises. If you're faithful until the point of death, you will receive the crown of victory. Right? And the crown of victory represents eternal life, the crown given to you at death. And in fact, to the one who conquers, right, they will not be hurt by the second death. Right? They don't have to worry about facing eternal punishment. Like we'll see later on in Revelation, second death refers to that everlasting death that certain people will have to face.